This is Dr. Hamilton. Welcome to my video series on William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. In this video, I'd like to discuss Act 1, Scene 2. So what we're going to see is with shocking speed, the conspiracy hatch before our eyes. It happens really quickly. Shakespeare telescopes a lot of events in that one scene, and yet it is very plausible and we see it develop before our eyes. So I said in a previous lesson that there are really two stories that Shakespeare wants to tell here. And one is a personal story about Brutus's corruption, his betrayal of his best friend and the man who is really a father figure to him, a Julius Caesar. The other is a story about the corruption of the Republic, as the ideals of the Republic begin to collapse in favor of one-man authoritarian rule, ushering in the period of emperors. So we're going to see both of those here. So what I want to do is start by giving you a sense of the arc of the entire scene, because it can be a bit confusing. What we have to know is that Caesar's presiding over a massive public holiday here. And there are big public events, games, celebrations, and the scene is dominated by the spectacle of Caesar coming in and going out with his retinue of patricians, servants, soldiers, etc. And a lot of the dialogue that we get is either of Julius Caesar and the people surrounding him, or the spectators who are watching the big spectacle of Julius Caesar kind of marching into the games and the activities and leading the festivities. So the scene opens with Caesar and his retinue entering. This is really the moment that the audience has been waiting for. And I think the question arises, how is Shakespeare going to depict this man? Caesar is a military commander. He conquered half of Europe. He then marched on Rome itself, winning a civil war against Rome. Recently, he's been named dictator for life. So what are going to be the opening words of this awesome historical figure? Well, Shakespeare doesn't give him opening words per se. He just gives him one opening word. And that opening word is the name of his wife, Calpurnia. So Act 1, Scene 2, lines 1 to 4, Caesar, Calpurnia. And then Casca, who is an attendant of Caesar's, cries, "Peace, ho! Caesar speaks!" It's as if Casca has not understood him and thinks that Caesar is proclaiming something to the public. "Peace, ho! Caesar speaks!" And then Caesar says, "Calpurnia," again, calling to his wife. So we might think of this as a note of tenderness. He has a close relationship with his wife. The first thing that he's thinking about is his wife here, right? And we're going to actually see that Caesar's wife in Act 2, Scene 2 will be the one who warns him not to go to the capital, where he will be murdered. But there's also a sense of possibly dependency or vulnerability here. Decius, one of the conspirators, will be able to shame Caesar by telling him that the senators will laugh at you for listening to your wife. This is in Act 2, Scene 1, when Caesar is being persuaded by the conspirators to go to the capital where he will be murdered. Beside, it were a mock apt to be rendered for someone to say, "Break up the Senate till another time, when Caesar's wife meets with better dreams." So we know that Caesar's embarrassment about his wife's influence on him will be the way that he is tricked into going to his death. So there's some vulnerability there in that opening moment. And it will hint at what later is possibly a shame at a closeness to his wife, an embarrassed dependency. It's not completely certain. We'll find out in the ensuing lines that Caesar wants Antony, his ally, as I said, who's going in one of in a race for one of the Lupercal celebration games to touch his wife Calpurnia to cure her of what he calls her sterile curse, her supposed barrenness. So the Lupercal was a fertility holiday, a bit like Valentine's Day, sort of on steroids in most of the English-speaking world because there's lots of games, festivities, and stuff. So it's not too strange that Caesar is involved wants to participate in kind of a good luck ritual for the fertility of his wife. But we should note here that what Caesar says is that his wife can't have children. If that's true, or if Caesar himself is impotent, then Caesar has no heir, which makes him vulnerable, right? If he wants to have a legacy, if he is killed, who is going to inherit the kingdom? It turns out that it will be Octavius Caesar, but who is Octavius, who is Caesar's grand nephew. But still, that note that there is no one to succeed him suggests vulnerability here. It provides a temptation for the conspirators to murder him because they think there's no one to succeed him. So there is this note of vulnerability and blight here. So immediately, Caesar's immense power and reputation is subtly undercut here by the way that he's introduced. So we have this grand figure who seems to be taken down a notch. And I think it may be, in part, because the mythology of Caesar is so great for Shakespeare's audience, he really can undercut him a lot because the audience's expectation for him is so great. So this is the point where Brutus and Cassius are left alone. This is when Cassius first begins to test Brutus to see if he is sympathetic to the idea of the conspiracy. So Cassius complains that he observes of late that Brutus does not have that gentleness and show of love towards his friend that he has had in the past. So there's something bothering Brutus that Cassius notices, and that is really significant. Cassius is a great observer. This word observes is important in relation to Cassius, and it will come up again when Caesar returns. And Caesar says of Cassius, "Yon Cassius has a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. Such men are dangerous." He is a great observer, and he looks quite through the deeds of men. So Caesar himself says that Cassius is a great observer, and right when he's introduced, we see it. We see Cassius observing Brutus and accurately observing Brutus. This spare Cassius, a great observer, he will understand Brutus better than Brutus understands himself, and that makes Cassius quite formidable. So Cassius, in his exchange with Brutus, will go on to ask Brutus a fairly jarring question. He says, "Can you see your face?" Strange question. I haven't been asked that recently, but Brutus responds by sort of taking him literally and saying that, no, it's a physical impossibility because you can only see your face by reflection. You're not actually looking at your face. You're looking at a reflection of your face. Cassius is suggesting here is that Brutus does not recognize what other people see in him, that they see that he does not see his hidden worthiness, that he is respected in Rome, that the public sees him as potentially a leader who might even be as great as Julius Caesar himself. But this opening exchange introduces this analogy of the mirror that gives us some insight into Brutus. The mirror is a well-known Renaissance analogy, and what it suggests is the wisdom and self-knowledge that rulers were supposed to possess in order to govern effectively. There's a 1599 collection of poems entitled "The Mirror for Magistrates," and it is about the tragic ends of those in power, some of whom lack insight into themselves that is needed by rulers. So Cassius is saying to Brutus something like, do you realize the respect that people have for you? But it's the same time, the mirror symbolically suggests and calls to mind an insight that we will later find out Brutus desperately lacks. Cassius is a keen observer, as Julius Caesar accurately remarks. Brutus is not a keen observer. In fact, Brutus's Latin name in Latin, Brute, means dull or stupid. Brutus is not stupid in a crude sense. He's not simple-minded. He's well-respected, and he has earned that reputation in Rome. And in fact, he has a moral grandeur that Cassius, of course, totally lacks, and that no other character, in fact, I would say no other character in all of Shakespeare has the moral grandeur that Brutus has. But we will discover that he has no insight whatsoever into himself, and that makes him really easy to manipulate. So this lean and hungry Cassius, this keen observer who looks quite through the deeds of men, is able to exploit Brutus's lack of insight into himself and corrupt him. What Cassius will do is hold up a distorted mirror to Brutus, showing him a monstrous part of his nature. To quote from Cassius, he will show him that of yourself which you yet know not of. Brutus is ignorant of the corrupt part of his nature, and we will find out about that later. So as the conversation proceeds, Cassius will then disclose the full extent of his resentment of Caesar. I had as lief not be as live to be in awe of such a thing as I myself. So Caesar and Cassius are both from ancient patrician families. Cassius regards them as equals. He is therefore appalled by Caesar's rise to power and by the fact that Caesar now wants to be treated like a god. He thinks this is utterly ridiculous. And so Cassius will tell these two personal stories about Caesar that actually happen, by the way, not to be in Shakespeare's source in Plutarch, which may suggest that Shakespeare intends that we think that Cassius is making them up. He says that he once saved Caesar from drowning, and he describes Caesar crying out to him, "Help me, Cassius, or I sink." And then he complains that this man, Caesar, that he saved from drowning, is now become a god, and Cassius is a wretched creature and must bend his body if Caesar carelessly but not on him. Then Cassius describes a military campaign in Spain in which Caesar became so sick with a fever that he did shake. 'Tis true this god did shake, his coward lips did from their colour fly, and that same eye whose bend doth awe the world did lose his lustre. I did hear him groan. So Cassius then compares Caesar's groans to a sick girl. So you can see how unworthy Cassius thinks Caesar is of this godlike status. And he certainly, whether or not these anecdotes actually happened, he certainly thinks that Caesar is immortal just like him, is a patrician just like him, and certainly does not should not have any pretense to aspire to the kind of godlike status of emperor that he has now attained. So although we have to be careful here, and as I said, there's two stories going on. There's a story of the conspiracy and Brutus's corruption by Cassius, and then there's the story of the corruption of the Republic, right? So Cassius's envy of Caesar is clear, but Cassius is appealing to equality. This is a real principle of equality. It is among the ruling class of patricians. It certainly is compelling nonetheless. It is a real moral argument. And this argument is certainly designed to appeal to Brutus. Whether or not Cassius believes it or not is another matter. But this is what Brutus is going to be concerned about, the threat that Caesar poses to the Republic. So we recall that in the opening scenes, the plebeians are celebrating that triumph for Caesar because he has defeated not an enemy of Rome, but another Roman general in a civil war. Caesar himself started that civil war when he marched upon Rome and overthrew the government in a military coup. So the threat to the Republic, which is a form of government that's predicated on this equality among the patrician class, is quite real. And so, again, Cassius may love Rome or he may not love Rome. He may only be envious of Caesar, but he's articulating real values. And that argument is really the only one that it seems Brutus is interested in. Brutus has a kind of selective hearing here. He only recognizes the noble, principled argument, and he doesn't see the obvious envy that Cassius has, that all of us can see. He does not recognize, in fact, the corruption of any of the conspirators. He projects his own noble motives onto other people. And this is really Brutus's tragic blindness in a nutshell. So in terms of Cassius's personal criticism of Caesar, to get back to that for a moment, there seem to be hints that suggest he might be right about Caesar, and we've already seen some of those hints. His vulnerable dependence on his wife, or the fact maybe that he doesn't listen to his wife enough, and he's easily embarrassed about his relationship with his wife. These sources of vulnerability seem to undermine Caesar's godlike ambitions, and they seem to support this idea that maybe he has a feeble temper. So indeed, when Caesar returns from the forum and will later disclose his suspicions of Cassius to Antony, we're going to see his grandiosity and his vulnerability all in the same sentence. He starts off, Caesar does, rather imperiously this is when he again talks about what he fears of Cassius, that he's a dangerous guy. He says, "I rather tell thee what is to be feared about Cassius than what I fear, for always I am Caesar." So this is boastful, imperious. Immediately after that, he says to Antony, "Come on my right hand, for this ear is deaf." So this grand figure, who claims to be immune from fear, needs Antony to approach him because of his deafness. You see right there in the same sentence, his disability and his proud imperiousness are right there, one side by side. So on one level, the historical Caesar may be regarded as, in fact, greater because he overcame his physical disabilities, including epilepsy. The play calls this the falling sickness. But these lines are clearly written to emphasize Caesar's combination of pride and physical and emotional vulnerability. The pride is undercut immediately by that physical and emotional vulnerability. That is not an accident. It's an ironic undercutting of Caesar's grand pronouncement. I rather tell thee what is to be feared than what I fear, for always I am Caesar. I am this immovable statue of greatness. Meanwhile, I'm also deaf. So he is clearly undercut by that next line. And so that frailty that Cassius talks about is there. And this trait, his pride and his vulnerability, will be an advantage the conspirators will seize upon in their plot to assassinate him. So it's after Caesar returns with his retinue and then moves on that Brutus will then learn from Casca, who remember is an attendant on Caesar, and he will linger behind. Casca will linger behind. That Antony, who is here introduced for the first time doing something significant, has just attempted 3 times to crown Caesar at the games. So I will discuss elsewhere how the exchange with Casca, again, a member of Caesar's retinue, he is the one that makes announcements on behalf of Caesar. Casca speaks to Brutus and Cassius in a kind of coded language that further reinforces the notion that there's a conspiracy brewing here. What's important to understand now, though, is that though Caesar has refused the crown, Casca suggests that he actually wants it. To my thinking, Casca says, he would fain have had it. So this supplies Brutus with a clear motive for joining the conspiracy, since he fears that Caesar wants to be king. So now we might pause for a moment and ask, since Caesar at this time is already dictator for life, what is the difference if he is actually crowned king? What difference would it make? What king, dictator for life? King, dictator for life. Well, there's a big difference to Romans. First of all, being a king will also imply that he has a legacy, successors, right? The line of the kingship will be passed to his children. But the other thing is historical. The Romans traditionally despised kings. In fact, Brutus's ancestor, as I indicated in the previous lesson, Lucius Junius Brutus, was honored for his defeat of Tarquinius Superbus, traditionally regarded as the last king of Rome. Brutus's ancestor was credited with the founding of the Roman Republic in 509 BC, almost 500 years before this happened. So the Roman crowd, despite their adoration, their abject worship of Caesar, are glad he refused the crown, quote unquote. So the account by Casca of Antony offering Caesar this crown seems to perfectly reinforce Cassius's picture of Caesar as an incipient tyrant who wants to be king over them all. So again, this anecdote that Casca tells perfectly confirms Brutus's worst fear about Caesar. So once again, I said we have the principled argument that Caesar wants to destroy the Republic, and that seems to have support here. At the same time, that personal story about Brutus's corruption by Cassius that leads him to betray his best friend, the man who was like a father to him, is also here. Although Shakespeare does not mention this, historically we should know that Brutus was on Pompey's side in the Civil War. And Caesar, in fact, bestowed a huge favor on him by forgiving him and promoting him after he was defeated. So it was also thought that Brutus was Caesar's illegitimate son, which is why people thought maybe that he had been promoted and given so much forgiveness. Dante, in the very famous medieval poem, the Inferno, places Brutus along with Cassio in the lowest level of hell because he betrayed the man who forgave him. Caesar forgave Brutus for being on the opposite side of the Civil War, promoted him, cultivated him, and Brutus betrayed him. So at the very end of the scene, Cassius, in his brief soliloquy, will reveal that his motives at this point in the play are entirely self-interested. As the play progresses, Cassius will become a more complex character, but we need to note that in this brief soliloquy, Cassius reveals himself to be purely envious of Caesar and really attempting to corrupt Brutus. So once again, right at the start of the play, we have the key players, so to speak, the key characters. Caesar, risen to a kind of godlike power, has aspirations to become king, emperor, anything that is associated with a title of greatness. Um, Hints of his egomania, but at the same time, his feebleness. Cassius, the great observer, the lean and hungry Cassius, manipulator, motivated, self interested, envious of Caesar. Brutus, high minded, concerned with the general good of Rome, but lacking tragically in insight into himself and really lacking in insight into the corruption of other people around him. It's totally on parade in Cassius's speeches persuading him that he is purely motivated by envy of Caesar, that his interests are personal in this assassination. Brutus does not see it here. And so we have to understand that this blindness actually, in a way, makes him more noble, gives him more stature, because he doesn't see, he's so noble that he doesn't see the corruption in other characters and other men. So we already have sketched here the arc of the story of Brutus's betrayal of Julius Caesar. So finally, we have Mark Antony briefly introduced as an ally of Julius Caesar. Antony will later, after Caesar's assassination, he will join Octavius, Julius Caesar's grandnephew, against the conspirators in the Civil War after Caesar's assassination. Antony is the one who offers Caesar that crown before the multitude. So I will leave you guys with that image of Antony offering Caesar the crown before the multitude. They are a powerful allies. Thanks very much, and I look forward to joining you again.